Nicholas Moore, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you, Laura.
You say that Australia's trade performance with Southeast Asia has been okay in the fact that it's growing but not as fast as the region, but that investment is actually going backwards. What have stakeholders told you about why that's happening?
Well, the positive story on the growth of trade is people see a lot of opportunities in terms of what we've been doing traditionally and some of the areas we'd like to be moving into. So it's been a very positive story in terms of trade on both sides, both from the trade from the region to Australia and from Australia to the region. From an investment viewpoint, again, we can highlight the positive, and the positive is that investment from the region in Australia has been growing and indeed is greater than the investment from Australia into the region. The question you asked, though, is the key one, is why hasn't Australian companies and Australian businesses invested as much in the region as the rest of the world? Because we can see the investment from the rest of the world has been stepping up. So foreign direct investment into the region has been stepping up. So why is that? It's partly as a result of what our businesses do. So a lot of the growth that's been taking place there has been for export-orientated manufacturing businesses. But that's not the whole story. And the whole story is how can we increase the awareness of what the opportunities are in the region for Australian businesses and allow them to become comfortable in what they see could be the future for them there.
Well, one analyst observed that a major challenge is, quote, the often perceived or actual risk related to political instability, regulatory barriers, corruption and currency fluctuation. Does Australian business need to have a really fresh look at the trading environment in these countries? And what's different now about the opportunities to, say, 10 years ago?
Yeah, well, you're quite right. There has been a lot of change that's taken place. Obviously, the economies are a lot larger than they were 10 years ago. The average rate of growth over the last 20 years is 8.5%. So obviously the economies are a lot stronger than they were. The opportunities are a lot greater. There's every Australian business leader who goes to the region who hasn't been there for 10 years or so is surprised by the amount of growth that's taken place. So number one is it's a lot bigger in terms of what's happening there. Secondly, from the point of view of political risk and currency risk, yes, there was political risk and currency risk if you look back to 1997 and the Asian crisis, but the economies have been very stable and have been growing strongly. The politics in the region also has been very stable over that period of time. So when you look at the level of debt in most of the countries as a percentage of GDP, it's modest, it's certainly manageable, and the ambition in terms of where the countries are at in their companies is a lot greater than it was in the past.
So you've headed up this new economic strategy for the government. What can governments do to improve things here?
So we've come up with 4 different categories of recommendations in our report. So the first one is coming back to this question of awareness. What are the opportunities in the region for Australian businesses and investors? And secondly, what are the opportunities in Australia for the Asian investors and businesses? So we've got a whole group of recommendations about how we can increase the awareness of each other's business opportunities. The second thing is focusing on blockages. So always between trade between two countries, there's a whole range of different blockages, issues that have to be dealt with. And so we've identified a whole range of those 2 ways. Everything we're doing with 2 ways, not just Australian investment in the region or the region's investment in Australia, but both ways. So we've identified a number of blockages that the government can take action to fix. Thirdly is capability, and capability comes very much down to people skills, how we can increase the capability of Australians to participate in the region and the region to participate in Australia, to actually look at the opportunities that exist today and opportunities we know that are coming tomorrow. And finally, we talk about investment. Can the Australian government think about its balance sheet, where it's putting its investments, and say, how can it help deepen investment between the 2 countries? So they're the 4 different categories that we've put 75 different recommendations, and we focused it on broad outcomes, and as well as that we've identified 10 different industry groups that we think have high potential.
Well, finally, you've had a long history in business, obviously. We've made bigger inroads, more successful inroads into Japan and China. What can we learn from those experiences about, who are the leaders into a market?
Well, I think we can be very optimistic given where we have been with Japan and China. When we look at Japan and we think about where Australia was placed in 1950 and compare with where we are placed today with the region. We're seeing that high levels of growth obviously taking place through a range of different countries in the region today. And it's important just to point out, obviously, that the countries are very different in terms of where they sit. But there's a lot of growth happening in a range of countries, very similar to Japan, export-led, urbanisation taking place. But think about the number of people from the region living in Australia today. More than 1 million people have come from Southeast Asia compared with where we were in Japan in 1950. Think about the number of universities, Australian universities carrying on their activities in the region today. We have over 500,000 alumni from Australian universities in the region today. So we're in a very strong position on a people-to-people basis. Our relationship with Japan and China, of course, was very strong, and we benefited from their industrialisation and from their export growth. We're looking at that same story in many of these countries of industrialisation, urbanisation, export growth, but we're in a much stronger position as a nation in terms of where we are with the region than we ever were with Japan and China. And as a consequence, we know Australia will benefit from the industrialisation and the growth and the urbanisation of the region. It's a question of how much more can we benefit given the stronger position we are, particularly in our people-to-people relationships today versus where we were in the past.
Nicholas Moore, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much, Laura.